Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tanks, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I'm now going to ask you to gently join me in pretending that this is entirely expected, and I'm going to turn down the microphone to avoid providing feedback for you. We strive for consummate professionalism here at the bookstore. We are gathered here today on this beautiful fall day to celebrate an incredible book. And that book is, of course, Away from the Dead, the Scotiabank Giller Prize long-listed new novel from David Bergen. This book was published by Goose Lane Editions, so thank you so very much to them for also helping to make this evening a reality. Thanks also to our good friends at the Winnipeg International Writers Festival for helping to co-present this evening as part of Thin Air 2023. Festival director Charlene Deal will be up at the end of the evening to tell you a little bit more about the festival itself. Just a few very quick housekeeping notes before we get into the reason you're really here. There will be a reading from this podium followed by a conversation that will take place to my left. After that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. If you do have a question here, please just put up your hand and I will run over to you with this microphone. Not a comment on your ability to project, just to ensure that everyone, including those watching at home, can hear your question. If you are one of those people watching at home, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat on the YouTube stream, and we will put them to David as time permits. If you have any pleasant comments or notes of encouragement, please feel free to also write those down. Following the signing, following the actual event, I'll just put one thing in your brain, and that's we'll ask all of you just to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport David to the signing table, which is just beside our cash desk. This just ensures that we can get him in place before you all descend to have your book signed. So thank you in advance for that. Charlene will have some more thrilling signing procedural notes for you at the end of the event. But that is more than enough about that. We are so thrilled to be hosting the launch for this incredible book, Away from the Dead. I feel like a bit of a broken record because every time I introduce David, I have to comment as to how this is one of my favorite books that he has ever written. And he has once again completely outdone himself. In this relatively slender volume is a book that feels like you're reading Eastern European epic. He has such an incredible way of economy with words that every sentence just contains its own world. And it was an exceptional book, and I could not be more pleased to be playing a small part in welcoming it into the world. You're also in luck because we have a very special person here to host a conversation with David. That is, of course, Maurice Mierau. His last book was a monograph on the work of Patrick Friesen entitled How Mind and Body Move. His memoir, A Detachment, won the Kobzar Literary Award, as well as the Alexander Kennedy Isbister Award for nonfiction. His poetry collections are autobiographical fictions, Fear Not, which was the winner of the Relit Award for Poetry, and Ending with Music. Mierau was founding editor of the Canadian fiction imprint Enfield and Wazenti, and of the online magazine Winnipeg Review. Praised by the Montreal Gazette as one of Canada's best writers, and by the Globe and Mail as inventive and electrifying, David Bergen is the best-selling author of numerous acclaimed novels and short story collections, including The Time in Between, which was the winner of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and Out of Mind, winner of the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. Away from the Dead is his 13th stellar book of fiction. He lives here in Winnipeg. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to see so many friends and acquaintances, and also my family is here, and also my family is watching on the screen, YouTube. And I do believe that in Montreal, where my daughter Hilary lives with her husband Jan, Ingrid might be watching as well. So Hello, Ingrid. I'm going to, before we have the interview, the conversation, I'm going to read a brief passage from the book, give you a little sense of what I'm going to read from. It shouldn't be longer than 10 minutes in case you get restless. And here we go. To set it up, Katka is a university student from the Mennonite colony of Kortitsa. She attends the university in Ekaterinoslav, which is modern-day Dnipro, falls in love with her Russian tutor, Julius Lane, and they elope. She writes her uncle, who is her guardian, to tell him what she has done, and he responds with 2 letters, one to Katka and the other to Lane. To Katka, he says, I am sorry we did not celebrate the wedding with you, dear Katka. When you are prepared, bring us the young man so that we might meet and have a proper wedding. Happiness should be yours, Uncle Heinrich. To Lane, he writes, there is justice and there is moderation. There is love of God and the church, and there is obedience to God and then to the Father. All that I have, the land, the farm, the crops, the horses, the houses, the laborers, all is in my name. It cannot be taken, it cannot be given, it is not yours to have. You are on loan. Don't get proud. Keep your nose to the earth. Katka has suffered illness. You will treat her well. No harm will come to her, financial or physical or spiritual. If there is any misstep, I will beat your head in. Now to the reading. For the first 3 years of marriage, they were happy. Lane's desire was purely for Katka, and her desire, though more muted than his, was also directed towards him. Sometimes he wondered if he was too fawning, too unctuous in his affections. Do I love you too much, he asked her. At first, she laughed and touched his head and said that too much love was impossible. But the question, asked perhaps too often, lodged in her brain, and she began to ask herself the same question. Does he love me too much? Am I simply his vessel? Do I have a mind of my own? Am I happy? He asked her that one morning. Are you happy? Of course, she said. And she kissed him on the forehead and left for university. She would be gone all day. Lane taught most mornings and worked at his translations, and then after lunch, he slipped into his boots and walked through the city, usually ending up near the university, always surprised by this, but perhaps not so surprised because he knew what he wanted, which was to catch a glimpse of his wife. He wasn't jealous, or was he? He might have been lonely. That afternoon, upon returning home, he reread Tolstoy's Family Happiness and immediately saw himself as the husband in the story who marries a younger woman. The newlyweds are happy for a time, 2 years, and then the young wife, Maria Alexandrovna, becomes bored and restless. She wants to experience others. She wants to be looked at. She wants excitement. And the husband allows this, but he is angry and confused. And the more confused he becomes, the more he pushes his wife away. Lane was more experienced than Katka and had had various lovers. And because of this, he had a knowledge of how desire can be slippery and happiness elusive. Tolstoy wrote in the voice of Maria, now it seemed quite plain and simple. The proper object of life was happiness. And I promised myself much happiness ahead. But it was impossible happiness, especially if you promised yourself much happiness or expected that happiness could be willed. True happiness came along with sadness, and sometimes happiness spilt out of a regular life. Excuse me. That's better. To try to explain all of this to Katka would have been futile. Her behavior had changed lately. She had taken up with some of the anarchists at the university who were followers of Bakunin and Kropotkin. She had become a drinker. She smoked thin cigars. Her language was more vulgar. Sometimes he imagined disgust in her eyes when she was looking at him. One evening, she asked him to come to a speech that was to be given at the university. The speaker was a man named Maxime. A friend, Lane asked. An intellectual, she said. And so he went and was surprised at Katka's popularity. The men, especially, who approached her and looked into her eyes and talked to her, ignoring Lane, who stood off to the side. When Maxime climbed onto the small stage, Lane noted that he was very short. He had no neck and a little head. One eye was higher than the other, as if he had spent his 30 years in life squinting at small print in a very small book. At first shy, he began to speak slowly, quietly, and then he picked up speed, or perhaps not speed so much as power, and his high voice lifted from his wide mouth towards the higher eye, and then he talked about ants. And he said that two ants who are from the same nest will approach each other, and if one has its crop full, the other will ask for food, and it will never refuse, and regurgitates a drop of transparent fluid that is licked up by the hungry ant. Regurgitating food for the hungry is a constant occurrence. If an ant is selfish and refuses to feed the hungry, the colony will fall upon the selfish ant with greater vehemence than they would upon their enemies. When Maxime finished speaking, there were cheers from the gathering, and the cheers sounded like many small animals who had gathered strength and were now howling in unison. Katka was also cheering. Lane stood quietly beside her. She took his hand and looked at him, and all the while opening her mouth, her voice lifting, her eyes angry and full. They returned home and sat by the stove in their new apartment, the one Uncle Heinrich was paying for. It was late. Lane said that Maxime's speech was a complete knockoff, Kropotkin's words, verbatim. He should have told us that. You don't steal ideas and say that they are your own. Katka yawned. She didn't want to argue with her husband, who had no political views other than the politics of privacy and solitude. Lane pulled at his earlobe and asked, "Are you sleeping with Maxime?" She laughed and said that everything was to share, even their bodies. If Maxime needs feeding, I will feed him. So you are the ant with the full crop, he said. I will share, she said. Do you give him your uncle's money? It's mine to give. I am sad, he said. She said, poor Lane, and she held him. That night, as she had over the last few weeks, she coughed up blood. Is it the chickens? He asked. Are you allergic? She had insisted that he keep a few layers in a cage in one of the extra rooms for fresh eggs, which arrived daily, and when the hen was done laying, she would make good soup. When Katka spoke of chickens and soup, he saw the vestiges of her past, the land and the pigs and the chickens and the grain growing in the vast fields, and he saw that all the money in the world cannot rub the soil from your skin. Of course, her disease was not from the chickens. It was a sickness that she carried in her lungs. He tried to feed her big meals. She wasn't interested. Go for a walk in the outside air. No desire. He was ashamed to beg, but he was also aware that he didn't want to have his head beaten in, and so he wrote to Uncle Heinrich. He said, your niece is very sick. She refuses to seek the help of a doctor. If perhaps you talked to her and told her that she needs the best care, she would find help. She listens to you. Katka was angry when she learned of the letter. You are trying to eliminate me, she cried, trying to pull me away from what I love. And it is not Maxime. I don't love him. I admire him. He listened to her rail and then listened to her cough, and he carried warm milk to her and wiped her brow and fed her soup made from a ham hock. Is it poison? She asked. Lane went to a meeting by himself where he sought out Maxime. He looked down on Maxime's little head and told him that Katka was very ill, that she needed to get help. But she wouldn't because of her devotion to Maxime. Can you speak to her? Maxime said that he admired Katka. She was a woman with fire in her heart. He loved the fire. He loved her strong heart. She is dying, Lane said. I will come, Maxime said. When he did not come, Lane grew angry and told Katka that Maxime had promised to come, but he hadn't. And what kind of man promises something and then disappears? You have no idea what a visionary he is. What a visionary is, Julius Lane. He has a burden to bear, and it is the weight of the poor, she said. He is above others intellectually. How hard that is, how little time there is. She was sitting in her chair. Her hair was dirty. He said that he would pour her a bath. He boiled water, mixed the hot and the cold water in the tub, testing it with his wrist, and then helped Katka undress and guided her into the bath. She was too thin. He kneeled by the tub and scooped water up with a bowl and poured the water over her scalp and brow. Some ran down her neck and over her shoulders. Her throat was bare and vulnerable. He thought of the chickens in the cage. He used soap to get lather her hair. And when the suds were plentiful and she was waiting to have her hair rinsed, he said that Uncle Heinrich had sent two train tickets for Baden-Baden. they would leave within a week. She did not argue. It was May 1904. Thank you. Yeah. Go to it.
So, David, you sent me a copy of this book to read when it was in manuscript, and I remember very clearly one of the things you were nervous about was that you would be historically inaccurate.
Yep.
And for some reason, you selected a poet who lives in your neighborhood to be the arbiter of historical accuracy. So I'm now just as nervous as you were, having made this foolish confession.
Well, that's good. That's good you raised that, because now we can point to you if there's anything wrong.
Exactly. Maybe your publisher can put an insert
Yeah.
just, you know, it's not the novelist's fault. But anyways, it just brings me to an interesting question, for at least I think it's interesting. What historians do is very different from novelists. You know, was it Lawrence who called the novel the great book of life? Maybe it was the great bright book of life. And I think he was getting at exactly the kind of thing that you were up to in that passage you just read. You know, the sheer physicality of it is what strikes me again and again in the book, having read it twice now. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about what I think you shouldn't be nervous about, which is how what you do is completely different than a historian, and in many ways, are interesting.
It was interesting because I did speak before the book came out this July at the Russlander conference, which took place at the University of Winnipeg, and it was a gathering of all those who were descendants of those who came from Russia as Russlanders. And they were gathered. They took the train across the country, and they had the gathering in Winnipeg. And I read there, and I got up and I said, I'm really nervous to be doing this, because I know, and I knew there were a lot of historians in that crowd, and I was worried. Now I survived, and they were very kind and generous. Nobody flayed me or told me you got it wrong, even though they may have imagined I got it wrong. Of course, nobody had read the book yet because it wasn't out. So this was, but I do not pretend to do an historian's job. Aileen Friesen, who interviewed me, is an historian and teaches at the University of Winnipeg, and was very generous in her response to the book. But I think I have a neighbor who is a history professor, and he may be here, I don't know, but he talks about the difference between, fiction and nonfiction, and let's assume that people who write history are dealing with it as nonfiction because they're talking about the facts. But he likes to quote John Updike's idea of hugging the shore, and the whole idea, and that's Updike's term, hugging the shore, which means that when Updike wrote his criticism, he said he was hugging the shore. When he wrote his fiction, he was out in open water. And and when you're in open water, you can quite easily capsize, and you take many more risks, and it's more dynamic and so forth. So this is not to say that those without the shore don't have something to say. They definitely do. And I used them in my research for this book, which was wonderful to have. And I borrowed from them. And so that to me is how I try to find that balance between. And I also say at the end of the novel, right, my last line, it's in the sort of end notes. It says, "This is a novel, all inaccuracies are the authors. So you sort of, you just decide, I'm going to, is that a bit of an escape, a little trick? Anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as well in the context of Mennonite history specifically, and I remember giving you some very bad advice which you ignored, as I expected that you would, and that was, I said, David, maybe you should include some kind of a little afterword about the history of the period or something like that. And I was sitting here tonight waiting and thinking, boy, it was great that David didn't do that, because again, when you think of that Lauren's phrase about the great book of life, when you're living in a great historical period like the one you're writing about here, 1918 to 1922 in southern Ukraine and southern Russia, no one gives you a book. Nobody's telling you what it means. Nobody's saying, here's some helpful contextual information that you could have that will help you understand why these people are bursting into your yard, trying to kill you, rape your daughters, and burn your house down. There is no such context.
I think that perhaps I do have historical characters in the novel, but they play minor roles and they appear. And this book here is one of Victor Shklovsky's book.
We will talk about that.
Okay, and there are others that are made reference to historical characters, but the figures that I was working with, the characters I was working with were minor, insignificant, I would say, and I wanted to catch I guess that was the only way I could see my way into the story, was to explore those who were minimal. And didn't understand what was going on around them. Some did, and there's an understanding that some did. And then I think the educated, more wealthy, let's use Mennonites at this point, did understand what was going on, and they saw that their land was about to be taken, and tried to fight against that. But I wanted to, have that structure where I had characters who didn't understand the chaos and the tumult and the danger they were in until it arrived on their doorstep.
Right.
I read the historians, not well. I became very confused as I wrote this novel. I have to admit, I had to constantly go back and say, well, okay, so this happened and this happened and this happened. So the chronology of events to me was very confusing, and I would still be confused. I wouldn't know if I'd be able to explain this is, because it all happened at once. And so I was always trying to write down dates, and then I write a line, and then I'd have it all spread out on this spreadsheet. But I still had difficulty understanding who was where, when, and what was happening, because it was all happening pretty much at the same time. And so that's where I talk about the inaccuracies, but if I got it wrong or not. But to go back to what I was saying, I found that memoir was especially helpful to me, and diaries, and especially letters, were especially helpful, because in memoir, you get what kind of shoes people were wearing, what kind of food they were eating, the clothes, the longing for boots. Boots played a big role in the making of this novel. I was aware as I was writing that everybody was talking about boots, and because nobody had boots, and they were making them out of flannel, they were making them out of cloth, and so it became one of the motifs in the novel itself. And now I'm lathering.
Yeah, there is a lovely passage about boots right at the end, but you'll get there later. So the one of the things I start to wonder about just this morning, and I should make a couple of other remarks about the chaos of the period, because you're being very humble here. I think anyone who studies this period is going to feel confused with or without a spreadsheet. So just if you think about the the major dates on the calendar, like the Bolshevik Revolution takes place in 1917, but the Soviet Union doesn't begin until 5 years later. So that entire period is just chaos, bloodshed, and all kinds of international actors involved, and multiple armies, and really the focus of the violence and the chaos was this area where our ancestors lived in what is now southeastern Ukraine, and where, of course, the kind of heirs to the people who are doing these awful things then are continuing to do it right now. So, in a way, what's in the news today is marvelously simple compared to what was going on then. I mean, then it was like it was difficult to count the bad guys, and of course the issues related to complicity were very, very complicated in a way that I don't think they are today. So to me, that's one of the impressive things about this book, is the way that you convey that confusion, which isn't just a result of your failure to grapple with historical sources, right?
Well, I'm not sure I want to get into the politics of what's going on, you know, but I do think that actually I would disagree. I think it is complicated. And it's not as simple as we would like to think it is. I don't think it's ever simple.
No, that's true.
And I think okay. So I started off with a Mennonite story. I thought I was writing a Mennonite story, and then I threw a Jewish character in, and I decided that, oh, that's good. I'm going to have an outsider's perspective of a community that sees things in a simple way. So I think Julius Lane is the Jewish character who happens to get together with Mennonites, and first Katka, and then another adopted child or adult when he gets together with her, Ina. And so my approach to it was that, okay, so you have a Jewish bookseller. And I love the fact that I have books in there, because I like to put books in my novels. In fact, I had an agent once say to me, why do you have so many books in your novels? Like, why don't you just write a story? And I thought to myself, well, no, I want books in the novel because that's where I get my stories from, you know? And so I didn't listen to her. And
yeah, that was a good move.
but so Julius Lane being a bookseller was very, I was very fond of him, and I loved the fact that he liked books, and I could also give my own sort of perspective on Russian novelists and writers through Julius Lane's perspective, right? So here he is, an outsider coming in, and he gets embedded in the Mennonite community, but doesn't really understand them.
Yeah. And is it a coincidence that he comes from the same neighborhood in Odessa as a certain writer who wrote a book called Red Cavalry?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I did borrow a lot from the Russian writers, and I sort of sprinkled all of these comments and quotes in there too. Yeah. In fact, there's in the first chapter, which I read from, it's called The Lady with the Dog, which is by Chekhov, and I just borrowed titles for my chapters, all from Russian writers, and it's funny. So you call them Russian writers, but Red Cavalry by Isaac Babel. Yeah. He was born in Odessa. Odessa is part of Ukraine now, so we call him a Russian writer, but it's hard to know, was he Russian, Ukrainian? Of course, he was Russian at the time.
Yes.
So anyway, that was an aside. So so in the first chapter, they end up in Badenweiler, Katka and Julius Lane, where there's a sanatorium. And in the same sanatorium, this is not giving anything away, in the same sanatorium, Chekhov is dying on the main floor, while Katka is dying on the second floor. And then there are lines in that chapter. For the astute reader who knows Chekhov, they'll catch lines. Oh, that's a Chekhov line. Oh, that's a Chekhov line. So I stole. I threw it in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is great fun.
Yeah, well, this is where it's so glorious that you ignored your agent because, you know, the often forgotten Northrop Frye often talked about how books are made out of other books. And of course, he stole that from T.S. Eliot, who stole it from a million other people. And really the entire basis of Western culture is theft.
Yeah.
So you were onto something good. Yeah. But yeah, let's talk for a little bit about our friend Victor Shklovsky. I'm never sure how to say that because I can't pronounce words that have big consonants, which leaves me in the cold as far as Russian pronunciation goes. But Shklovsky is sort of famous in literary criticism because he came up with this idea of estrangement, which has a Russian word that I won't try to pronounce. It starts with O. But anyway, what's much more remarkable to me than his theory is this book called A Sentimental Journey, which is a kind of a parody of a famous 18th century novel by Lawrence Stern, which in itself was a parody of travel literature at the time. And travel literature at the time was kind of like reality TV is now.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like a sitcom or something shot in documentary style that made fun of, you know, foolish forms of entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so fascinating that Shklovsky picks up on this in order to talk about the same period that you're writing about. And he writes about it in such a vivid and physical way. And he's this, you know, he's this high-powered intellectual. He's in a part of the socialist movement that is going to lose the fight with the Bolsheviks, and many of them are going to be murdered by Lenin and Stalin. He somehow survives into his 80s, publishes dozens and dozens of books, and many of which I haven't read. But to me, this is the amazing accomplishment. And I just, like, you have a great long passage of his in the book.
Stolen again.
Footnoted, however. So
Footnoted,
you know,
yes,
you're a Mennonite. You did it right. I know that made you uncomfortable.
Yes, in fact, what I take from Shklovsky in that book, Shklovsky actually shows up in the novel.
Yes,
And
as one of your minor characters.
As one of my minor characters,
Yeah.
and Julius Lane becomes his attendant as he takes him over to St. Pete's, as they say,
Yeah.
St. Petersburg,
Mhm.
and they talk literature, they talk, but Shklovsky, he's a commissar in the Russian army.
Yeah.
And so Julius Lane picks him up, they move on, and there's 362 words that I stole from Victor Shklovsky, and the reason I know that is because I had to get permission from the publisher,
Right.
Valkyrie Press, I believe it is, who they said, well, yeah, you could use those words, but I sort of took them and I put them in the novel, and that's why I know it's 362 words that I took from that book.
Right.
Yeah, and so it's that too was great fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such a marvelous idea. It's one of the most brilliant things about the book for me as a Russian lit geek, that you pick this particular writer and paired him with this seemingly minor character who is a little bit of a mouthpiece for Mr. Bergen. By the way, do you agree with Julius that Tolstoy was a god?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, please explain.
Oh.
A little bit. And also why it's not Dostoevsky.
Oh, no, not Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky you read when you're 18 years old and you've been drinking all night, and then you read it, you know, and then you go out and you talk to. I love Dostoevsky. I think it's wonderful. I'm not criticizing Dostoevsky, but Tolstoy. Okay, so there's this anecdote that is told about Nabokov. And I'm saying Nabokov in a pretentious way, but that's how you pronounce it. All my life I've said Nabokov, but tonight I'm saying Nabokov. Okay? So there's this anecdote about Nabokov. He was teaching literature at a university. I forget when it was in the States. And
Princeton.
Okay, so he's teaching literature, and there's a big lecture hall, and he walks in, and he's going to teach Russian writers. And he says, I hope I get this right. He walks up to the lights, up at the top of the podium or whatever, and it goes up, switches on one light, and he says, in the pantheon of Russian literature, this is Gogol. He switches on another light, and this is Pushkin. And then he goes down and he takes the blind from the window and he throws it up, and he says, and this is Tolstoy. And I thought it's a great anecdote. I thought, and so that's the way I feel about Tolstoy.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
I
there's
could
a
go
rational
into-
explanation.
I could go into all kinds. I can go into all kinds of descriptions of why go there.
Yeah, no, it's not worth it.
But
People
it's
should just
beautiful.
people should just read Tolstoy.
Yeah.
Quit your job and start working
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway,
Even if you've read it.
I should say, Maurice actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So this book was originally passed to me by Maurice, and it was like a gift. It was like, whoa. When I read it, I thought, okay. So Maurice is, I benefited from him passing it to me and saying, read this book, and so it guided me in many ways through. I don't write like Shofsky, not at all.
No, you certainly don't.
No.
Like that passage that you quote, this is one of the great things about these forms of stealing, is because it gives you a whole different stylistic register, which is other people's. And, he uses all these marvelous metaphors. He's really full of, and he juxtaposes them in ways that are really startling. Even in translation, you just go, whoa.
Yeah.
And I did want to read a little passage just to give people an idea of what it's like, because this is a totally different passage than the one you quoted, which is actually more Bergen-esque, I would say, to travel in time backwards or the wrong way. So this is a little anecdote. He says he ran into a soldier from our Persian army. And remember, this is a memoir about his own experience in the Russian army on various fronts. And he was all over the place. He was in Persia for part of the time. So this chapter is set there. So Iran nowadays. He says, he told me another detail about the explosion. That's a one-sentence paragraph, which is such a lovely setup because it makes you think it's going to be nothing. And then here's the anecdote. After the explosion, our soldiers, surrounded by enemies, were waiting for a train to come for them. While waiting, they busied themselves by picking up and putting together the shattered pieces of their comrades' bodies. They picked up pieces for a long time. Naturally, some of the pieces got mixed up. One officer went up to the long row of corpses. The last body had been put together out of the leftover pieces. It had the torso of a large man. Someone had added a small head. On the chest were small arms of different sizes, both left. The officer looked for a rather long time. Then he sat on the ground and burst out laughing. And then new paragraph. In Tiflis, I'm returning to my trip. A crime was committed. And then he describes a war atrocity. But the book just moves like this from one of these things to another. And I think the reason it's bearable for the reader is because of this kind of detached, ironic tone. It's very different from the tone in your book, which is engaged in a certain way, but you feel the distance because you haven't experienced these things and it's a long time ago. But he's
definitely not.
But in Shklovsky's case, he's there, and the way he deals with it for you as a reader is that he's ironic. It's
yeah,
really,
and I agree.
Yeah.
that he is, and I don't think I've ever used irony as a form in my writing.
no, and especially not when you deal with violence.
Yeah.
Your violence it's present.
Yeah, and I don't find that particular passage ironic. I think it's actually incredibly sad, but he is distanced from it.
Yeah, you're right. Ironic doesn't describe the tone there. Detachment is more the operative mode. Yeah.
So anyway, I did appreciate having that, but then I moved on. Of course, Shklovsky becomes a part of the novel, but Lane goes home, and I wondered if we could talk a little bit about I'll just start to talk.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to say this. I grew up in a home and in a church where every October, and I said this at the Russlander conference as well, where every October we would listen to David Dick. He had 3 fingers on one hand, he was like this. And he'd wag them like this while he talked, because he'd lost them. I don't know how he lost them, axe probably. Anyway, he would talk and he would tell in deeply felt ways about the time, the experience he had during the revolution in Russia, and how Nestor Makhno would rampage through the villages and slaughter the Mennonites. And I was incredibly moved by these stories. And every October I had to listen to the same thing and was moved by it. And it was only later, as I started to read, and I read Makhno's memoirs and various other pieces on Makhno, that I realized, oh, there's more to the story than just Makhno being an evil man. That he was an anarcho-communist who ran with a large group of men and tried to free Ukraine. And so it was interesting. I was originally going to put Makhno in this novel, and I had written a whole chapter set in Paris, and it was called Makhno in Paris. And I thought, well, if I can't use it there, maybe I'll write a short story called Makhno in Paris, which has a good ring to it. And anyway, I had written about 40 pages of this chapter, which was called Makhno in Paris, and he died in Paris of tuberculosis in 1932. Mm-hmm. He managed to escape, and he had his daughter and his wife with him. But I decided that no, I'm not going to go there. I don't have any other big historical characters in this novel. Why are you going all of a sudden having Makhno in this character in this novel? So I left him out, other than to refer to him later on in the novel as in passing.
Yeah, and I think that works really well. He's a kind of a ghostly presence. Mm-hmm. He's a terrible kind of ghostly presence.
Yes. Complicated.
And yes, complicated too.
But loved by the Ukrainians.
Yeah,
by the peasants.
Yeah,
he was a hero. Yeah, he was a hero.
Yeah, so I had wanted to ask you about your personal connection with some of this material, and you just talked about that. So that's really good. Well,
my father came out of Ukraine in 1926.
Okay.
And his father before that was in the White Army as a medic, and but those were not stories that necessarily attached themselves to me, other than my father wouldn't remember, other than stories that were told to him and passed down. So those kinds of things were talked about, but not terribly specifically or in great detail. So other than the fact that supposedly my grandfather came home from the war with white hair at the age of 23. From shell shock. Now, whether that's apocryphal, true, it's told that story told of many men who returned with white hair.
Yeah, well, likely true. Yeah. So I had a question that it's a short question, but it has a long windup. So I'm mindful of the time. But the windup is, I was thinking to myself in a somewhat satirical mode, what if this had been a generational saga in which the characters, we follow the characters to the brave new world of North Kildonan, and they start, very successful painting companies and box manufacturers and, all those kinds of things. And their children go to evangelical churches that aren't called Mennonite, where they have Korean services in the afternoon, which are separated only for linguistic reasons, you understand, not anything else. And the next generation would have mildly updikesh adventures that would flirt with various kinds of moral hypocrisy and so on. We can all imagine this book because it's been written many times. But I may have answered my own question. So why did you stop at page 216?
Oh, I know. People have said, like, this is too thin a book for so much rich material, and it was rich material. And, and like I said, I cut out 40 pages of Paris and Makhno, meaning I'd admit, and so forth. And I cut out other stuff, and I realized that I wanted to keep it tight, to the point. singular, with a singular vision perhaps. And I think singular vision is okay in a novel. I'm not particularly good at exploding off in all kinds of different directions. And so I kept it to, how many pages did you say it was?
I think 216.
216, that's very straight. Yeah. Slender.
Yeah, that's what John said.
Yeah, he did say that, yeah. So I also wanted it to end and then have the list of the characters at the end of where they ended up. And I think it has there's some oomph there. Yeah. Where you said, whoop, it's over. Oh no, it's not over. Some of them lived, some of them died. Oh, they all died. You wanted me to call the book The Dead. And then, you know, James Joyce wrote a short story called The Dead. And there are numerous, Dostoevsky wrote a book, help me out here. House of the Dead.
Yes.
Yeah, House of the Dead. And so, but then I also thought The Dead could sound too much like a zombie novel. And I didn't want it to be that. And so I won't name the person who gave me the title, but he's here. Away from the Dead.
Yeah.
One of my first readers. Yeah.
Okay, and so last question, can you get away from the dead? Is it possible in the world of the novel?
We are constantly moving away from the dead. If we are into living.
Yeah.
I think that's human nature.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah, it's a good thing. Okay, so I should open up the floor to those of you who want to ask questions.
So if you do have a question, please just raise your hand and I'll wander over to you with the microphone. And if you're watching online, just write your question in and I'll get to that. Were there any questions in the audience? Yes.
When you are dealing with with an event in the past, how do you infuse present emotion into the characters?
Not sure. Good question. Maybe not answerable, but I'll try. I think when I was writing the book, I don't speak Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian. I don't speak any of the language that are in the book. And so I thought to myself, well, what am I doing? Well, I'm writing a novel. How am I writing the novel? I'm deciding to write the novel as I decided, okay, I'm going to write it as if it were a translation. And I want to have a perfect translation. So it's going to be in English. And I am going to make it feel, try to make it feel that it's in the present, taking place right now. And I don't know if I succeeded, but that's what I wanted to do. So I tried to give a sense of, okay, the reader should feel that this is happening right now. Even though I say at the end of the passage I read, it was 1904, I still believe that you can give a sense of that emotion coming through, and that, and also you don't talk. I don't want to talk about the emotion that the characters are feeling. I describe, I list things, and the emotion should come through that description, I think. Yeah. So I don't, again, whether it succeeded or not, that's my aim. Yeah.
Great talk. Just a question that adds to that when you're talking about it and being in the present. Is there a character that you saw yourself looking through the eyes through more than any other character? And if so, was there an event in your life that you felt was echoed in the book at the time you were writing?
Personal, sorry.
Yeah. No, I can't point to a particular point in my personal life that would say this is me. This happened to me, not at all. But I do think, and Maurice alluded to that I was using Julius Lane as a voice, to project through Julius Lane, and that's sort of he was reading the books I loved. He was maybe had a certain affect that I appreciate and wanted to convey. So if anything, I'm not Julius Lane, of course, but I probably would be the closest to him in maybe outlook, He was a pacifist. I can't claim to be a pacifist. I was. People attack me on the road. I suffer road rage all the time, and then I get mad back. Yesterday, I got buzzed on the bicycle. I was on the bicycle, and this other bicycle comes by, and he's that close to my ear, but he's on an electric bike. And I said, "Whoa, what was that?" He said, I won't repeat what he said, but he said basically like, "Stop at the stop signs," he said. And I said back, "Get a real bike." But I'm not, this is not anything against electric bikes. I thought, really? You're gonna buzz me on a bicycle? So I'm not a pacifist.
Modern Ukraine now with all the problems, and in what sense are you saying that it's the same now as it used to be, or is that what you're saying? Because,
No, I'm not saying that.
okay,
I'm not saying that.
because we all know what's happening in the Ukraine, and I read the Mennonite history there, Krechitsa and Molochna, and they had to leave, right?
Mhm.
And they left, my parents left with the Germans. And I'm just kind of curious as to what you were meaning about times are the same.
I don't
You're
know
not
if
saying that?
I don't think I said that. I don't think I said that, but I can address that. I can address that in talking about my grandfather coming out of Russia. I wouldn't be here today so I want to be very careful that I'm not criticizing and that's why I wrote a novel. I wanted to give different perspectives. And I think if you look at my characters and you understand where the characters are coming from, you will see there's no political agenda in these characters. And I don't believe I should have a political agenda when I'm writing a novel. I'm not here to teach people or to, I'm writing a novel. I'm exploring my own doubts about what actually took place, and I'm curious, and I'm curious what was right, what was wrong, and so no, I'm not saying that, and I apologize if it came out that way. Yeah.
It was probably my fault.
No. Blame it on me.
And we do have time for one or two more questions if there are any from the audience.
Actually, his headquarters was in the 4-star hotel in Dnepropetrovsk. And the post office there was also part of his headquarters. They lived in the 4-star hotel, Akhnode, and they used the post office. And if you ever see the post office, it's gorgeous. It's just, the architecture is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And to think that he was killing Mennonites 100 at a time would live there. And that's a city that Catherine the Great built for the Mennonites who she took to Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also used the famous Mennonite wagons to carry his guns. So yeah.
So we have two more questions, one over here and one.
I have a question. Usually, some of the authors, they prefer to determine the character's fate in advance. And what about yours? Maybe sometimes the preferences for some of the characters, does the preference change your attitude or even their ending in your novel?
Their preference, did you say?
Yeah, your preference. For example, you prefer some of the characters, and as the writing goes on, does this affect their ending in your book?
I see. In other words, you're asking, does the characters, I might have had a certain vision for the character at the beginning, but as the story moves through, that vision changes. Is that what you mean? Or, yeah. Stories evolve. For me, stories evolve as I write. I have a sense of the ending, but they evolve, and characters evolve as well. And so there's definitely change that happens. The characters' main sort of approach to the world doesn't change, but something that happens to them that makes them react, that might make them change. So there is change that happens as I write. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, what about the ending?
This particular ending, did I know the ending before oh, did I know the ending before I wrote it? No, obviously not, because my ending took place in Paris. and I dropped Paris out of and then I just stopped it at the point where it's both sad and happy. And so there's a blend of both that happens at the end of the novel. Yeah.
And we'll now move along to the final question of the evening.
And it's not a question, but I just wanted to say I moved to Winnipeg from Toronto in 1998 in my 20s and found McNally Robinson, and I had a section of regional interest, and your book, A Year of Lesser, was the first Winnipeg writer I'd ever read, and it says, I love Winnipeg and I love prairie writers, and I hold you personally responsible. So
Well, thank you for moving first.
That is a wonderful note to end on, but I'll also leave it to you folks if you have any closing comments before we bring Charlene up.
It's your Charlie.
What an amazing conversation. What an amazing conversation. Will you please put your hands together for Maurice and David? Such a strong sense that this is part that we've had a chance to sit in on, part of a conversation that's been ongoing for a long time. There's so much richness in the way that you exchange ideas, and I think we're gonna all find as we read this book that it has more of a bloom because we've had a chance to hear this conversation. And I do really love this idea about the novel being a kind of exploration rather than an announcement about values, but a kind of a curious wander through different perspectives. And that's just something that you do so beautifully, David. So congratulations on the nomination. And I hope you win. Don't you think? Let's go for it. So before I release David to go over and sign a bunch of books, I do want to, take advantage of this, of you all in a captive space here, to say that we're really delighted now that Thin Air, our annual festival, is now begun. And we had our launch last night, and this is our first event here at McNally. We have quite a great lineup here, so I'm just gonna give you the high points. So tonight, we welcome David Bergen, tomorrow Joan Thomas. So those are a couple of stellar writers from Winnipeg. Jordan Abel is coming in on Tuesday, next Tuesday, thank you. From Edmonton, Beatrice Mozione is coming here on Friday, the 29th. And on Saturday, September 30th, that's the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we have Mijote stories here in honor of Theodore Fontaine. And the guest is Daryl J. McLeod, who is a really extraordinary memoirist and now novelist. And forward from there, we have Casey Plett, Alicia Elliott, John Clausen, Emma Donahue, Michael Crummy, and then a few days after the festival ends, Waukesha Rice. So it is an amazing lineup, and I hope you'll come back often, because every single one of these writers is worth an hour in this beautiful space. I'd like to make a mention of Goose Lane Edition, which is the publisher of David's beautiful book. Goose Lane really makes gorgeous books, and they're always so well edited. I don't know, you guys sort of get that feeling when you just see a typo that you think, oh, I don't really want that to be there. One of the things I love about Goose Lane books is they're beautifully edited. It just doesn't happen all the time. So It's a small independent publisher, and I think they need a little extra, cheer once in a while. Before we wind up, I'd like to obviously recognize this extraordinary place we get to gather. McNally Robinson is one of the cultural hubs of this city and of the prairies in many ways. And you've watched John hop in and out, making everything look he's like an athlete back here. I call him the Wizard of Oz, and it seems to fit. And Chris and Angela at the back, these guys make this place our home for readers and for all of us who need to gather as part of the community and understand that we together have a way of making the world that we want to live in. So will you please join me in making a really rousing thank you to McNally for providing this kind of space for us. Now, my instructions are that you must stay put. Well, you've heard this before, right? Well, David is transported to the sign table, which is over by the cash desk. Safely transported, because it's a very dangerous environment here. So you need to stay seated until David is taken over there. I think in a litter carried by 4 strong people or something, I don't know. I keep watching for that, or a wagon. And you can line up and get your books signed. The only real rule is that you pay for the book before you leave the store. They do it like that here. Thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night.
Can I just say something?
Yes, you can.
Quickly. If you do happen to write a book and you do happen to line up and you want me to sign it, sometimes my memory fails me, and if I say to you, who do you want to sign to? You just say, you don't say, I want to sign to me. You say, I want to sign to David or to George.
And ideally you spell it, right?
So my apologies in advance.
Thanks so much.